April 1945, Ruhr Pocket. A 19-year-old German soldier had to choose, surrender to the Americans and likely survive, or wait for Soviet forces and face a 1 in 3 chance of dying in a labor camp. He wasn't alone. 300,000 men were making the same calculation, walking west with white flags. Cold stone pressed against Klaus Müller's cheek as he woke in the basement of a destroyed factory somewhere in the Ruhr. The 19-year-old Obergefreiter had stopped asking what day it was 3 weeks ago. Time had collapsed into a single endless moment of hunger, fear, and the constant thunder of American artillery creeping closer with each passing hour. Above him, through the shattered ceiling, gray dawn light filtered through smoke that never seemed to clear anymore. He hadn't eaten in 48 hours. None of them had. The 40 men of his company, what remained of the 116th Panzer Division, had been reduced to drinking rainwater from shell craters and chewing on leather belts to fool their stomachs into thinking food was coming. It wasn't. No supply convoys had reached them in 2 weeks. No ammunition trucks, no medical supplies, no orders that made any sense. Just the same impossible command repeated from division headquarters until the radio went silent. Hold your position. Boots scraped on broken concrete. Hauptmann Werner Steiner descended the stairs into the basement, his uniform hanging loose on a frame that had lost 20 pounds since the Americans crossed the Rhine. At 34, Steiner was a career officer, a professional soldier who had fought in France and spent 2 years on the Eastern Front before being transferred west. Klaus had watched him age a decade in the past month. The captain's face was gray in the dim light. He gathered the men with a gesture, and they assembled without speaking. 40 ghosts in Wehrmacht field gray. Their weapons held more from habit than any belief they would use them again. Outside, the artillery had stopped. That was somehow worse than the shelling. Silence meant the Americans were close enough that their forward observers could see individual targets. Silence meant the end was measured in hours, not days. Steiner looked at each man in turn. When he spoke, his voice was steady but quiet, the tone of someone who had made a decision that would haunt him forever. Gentlemen, I am releasing you from your oath. Drop your rifles, walk west. Find an American, it is your only chance to survive. The words hung in the basement like smoke. Klaus felt something break inside his chest. Not his heart, but something deeper. The structure that had held him upright through 3 years of war. He had been 15 when he joined the Hitler Youth, 17 when he was conscripted, 18 when he first fired his rifle at another human being. Every moment of those years had been built on a single foundation. A German soldier fights to the death, never surrenders, serves the Führer until the last breath. Now his captain, a man who wore the Iron Cross First Class, who had led them through a dozen battles, was telling them to throw down their weapons and walk toward the enemy with their hands up. "Sir," someone said, and Klaus realized it was his own voice. The oath. We swore. Steiner's eyes met his, and Klaus saw something terrible there. Not anger, but a kind of exhausted pity. The oath was to a man who is sitting in a bunker in Berlin sending children to die for a war that ended months ago. I am giving you an order, Miller. Walk west. Live. That is all that matters now. He turned and climbed the stairs without waiting for questions. The men stood in silence, looking at each other, looking at their rifles, looking at anything except the truth that had just been spoken aloud. The war was over. They had lost. And now they had to decide whether to die for a lost cause or live as prisoners. Klaus made his decision in the time it took his heart to beat twice. He set his carabiner 98K against the wall, removed his ammunition pouches, and placed his helmet on top of the rifle. Around him, other men began doing the same, the clatter of equipment being discarded echoing in the basement like a funeral bell. By the time the sun was fully up, Klaus and 12 others were walking west through the ruins of the Ruhr, carrying improvised white flags made from torn undershirts tied to sticks. Behind them, the industrial heartland of Germany burned. Ahead, somewhere in the smoke and rubble, were the Americans, and survival. The Ruhr Pocket had not been created by accident. It was the result of one of the most successful encirclement operations in military history, a textbook example of mobile warfare that trapped an entire German army group in a matter of days. On March 23, 1945, Operation Plunder began with the Allied crossing of the Rhine River, the last major natural barrier protecting Germany's industrial core. British and American forces established bridgeheads on the eastern bank, and within 72 hours, They had poured enough men and armor across to begin a breakout that would change the character of the war in the West. The American First Army, under General Courtney Hodges, drove northeast from Remagen. The Ninth Army, under General William Simpson, pushed southeast from Wesel. They were not advancing to capture territory. They were racing to meet each other, to close a noose around the Ruhr industrial region and everything inside it. On April 1, 1945, advance elements of the two armies met at Lippstadt, a small town that became historically significant for a single reason. It was where the encirclement was completed. In 4 days of rapid armored advance, the Americans had surrounded an area of roughly 4,000 square kilometers containing Germany's most important industrial cities, its coal mines, its steel mills, and more than 300,000 German soldiers. Field Marshal Walter Model commanded Army Group B, the force now trapped inside what the Americans were already calling the Ruhr Pocket. Model was 54 years old, a career officer who had earned Hitler's complete trust through a combination of tactical brilliance and fanatical loyalty. The Führer called him his fireman, the general he sent to crisis points to stabilize collapsing fronts. Model had performed miracles on the Eastern Front, holding together armies that should have disintegrated, organizing counterattacks that delayed Soviet advances by crucial weeks. But there were no miracles left in April 1945. Model found himself commanding a force that existed only on paper. His army group consisted of the 5th Panzer Army and 15th Army, impressive names for formations that had been bled white by months of continuous retreat. The divisions under his command were divisions in name only, most reduced to regimental or even battalion strength, their ranks filled with a desperate mixture of combat veterans, undertrained replacements, and increasingly, men who had no business being in combat at all. The Volkssturm, Germany's last-ditch home guard, made up a significant portion of the trapped force. These were men between 16 and 60 who had been handed rifles and told they were now soldiers. Some were veterans of the First World War, old men who remembered the trenches and knew exactly how this would end. Others were boys who should have been in school, children playing at war with real bullets. They had minimal training, obsolete weapons, and no illusions about their chances. Luftwaffe ground personnel swelled the numbers further, pilots without aircraft and mechanics without planes to service, retrained as infantry in a matter of days, and thrown into defensive positions they had no idea how to hold. Foreign volunteers, Russians and Ukrainians who had joined the Wehrmacht to fight Stalin, found themselves trapped in a pocket with nowhere to run, and no country that would take them if they did. And scattered throughout were the SS units, the true believers who still thought the war could be won, who still believed in final victory and secret weapons and the Führer's genius. They were the ones who would shoot anyone who talked about surrender, who would fight to the last bullet and take as many men with them as possible. Model established his headquarters in a forest near Wuppertal and tried to organize a defense that made no military sense. He had no air support, the Luftwaffe having ceased to exist as an effective force months earlier. He had minimal artillery ammunition, most of his heavy guns having been lost during the retreat across the Rhine. His supply situation was catastrophic, with no way to bring in food, fuel, or medical supplies through the American encirclement. The geography of the pocket worked against any organized defense. The Ruhr was not open terrain where armies could maneuver. It was an industrial landscape of cities, factories, coal mines, and dense urban development, a nightmare for defenders trying to establish coherent lines. American forces could probe, find weak points, and drive wedges between German units that had no way to communicate with each other or coordinate responses. By April 10th, the pocket had been compressed to roughly half its original size. American and British forces were systematically reducing it, not through massive frontal assaults but through constant pressure, artillery bombardment, and airstrikes that destroyed anything that moved during daylight hours. The German forces inside were not being defeated in battle. They were being starved, isolated, and left to collapse under their own weight. The numbers told the story. Model commanded, at least on paper, more than 317,000 men. 30 German generals were trapped inside the pocket. An entire generation of senior military leadership. Complete divisions that had fought across Europe now found themselves compressed into areas measured in city blocks. Their command structures intact, but their combat power reduced to almost nothing. And every one of those 300,000 men was making the same calculation. They were surrounded. They had no supplies. They had no hope of relief. The war was clearly lost, Berlin was about to fall, and Hitler was either dead or soon would be. They could fight and die in the ruins of the Ruhr, or they could surrender. But surrender to whom? That was the question that kept men awake at night, the choice that would determine whether they lived or died, whether they saw their families again, or disappeared into the vast machinery of captivity that had already swallowed millions. The Soviet Union was advancing from the east, and every German soldier knew what that meant. Hans Becker was 26 years old and had survived 3 years on the Eastern Front, which made him either the luckiest or unluckiest man in the Ruhr Pocket, depending on how you looked at it. He had fought at Kursk, retreated through Ukraine, held the line in Poland, and been transferred west in March 1945 as part of a desperate attempt to reinforce the Rhine defenses. He arrived just in time to be trapped in the encirclement. Becker had seen things in the east that he would never speak about, not to his family if he ever saw them again, not to his children if he lived long enough to have any, not even to himself in the quiet moments before sleep. He had seen what happened when the Red Army overran German positions. He had seen the bodies of prisoners who had been captured and what had been done to them before they died. He had heard the stories from refugees fleeing west, tales of mass executions and revenge killings and atrocities that mirrored what the Wehrmacht had inflicted on Soviet territory during the invasion. The numbers were already becoming clear even in April 1945, though the full accounting would take years. The Soviet Union had suffered catastrophic losses during the German invasion, somewhere between 20 and 27 million dead, a number so large it lost meaning. Entire cities had been destroyed, villages burned, populations murdered or starved. The Red Army advancing into Germany in 1945 was not interested in following the Geneva Convention. They were interested in payback. German soldiers captured on the Eastern Front faced a fate that was statistically worse than being killed in combat. Of the approximately 3 million German prisoners taken by the Soviets during the war, roughly 1 million would die in captivity. They died of starvation in transit camps, of disease in Siberian labor camps, of exposure in the Arctic, of exhaustion in the mines and forests where they were worked until they collapsed. The survivors would not return home until the 1950s. Broken men who had lost a decade of their lives to forced labor in conditions that violated every principle of international law. The stories had reached the West. Refugees brought them, soldiers transferred from the Eastern Front carried them, and Nazi propaganda amplified them into a weapon of terror. Some of the stories were exaggerated, but many were not. The massacre at Nemmersdorf in East Prussia, where Soviet troops killed German civilians in October 1944, had been documented by German forces who briefly retook the town. The mass rapes that accompanied the Soviet advance through Poland and into Germany were real, systematic, and on a scale that would traumatize an entire generation. Becker knew these things not from propaganda, but from direct observation. He had been part of a unit that briefly retook a village in Poland from Soviet forces in January 1945. What they found there had made hardened veterans vomit. The German prisoners had been shot, but not quickly. The civilians had fared worse. "I saw what happened to men captured by the Russians," Becker told the soldiers around him in the basement where they sheltered from American artillery. "They didn't make it to camps. They were shot in ditches or worked to death building roads. The ones who survived the first month were sent to Siberia, and nobody comes back from Siberia. We all know the choice. West means life. East means death. It's that simple." The calculation was being made by every German soldier in the Ruhr Pocket and across the entire collapsing front. The Americans and British followed the Geneva Convention, more or less. They fed their prisoners, provided medical care, kept records, and allowed Red Cross inspections. Survival rates for German POWs in Western Allied captivity were high, well over 90%. Most would be released within a few years and allowed to return home. The Soviets followed no such rules. They viewed German prisoners as war criminals who deserved whatever fate befell them, and that fate was usually death by starvation, disease, or exhaustion. The survival rate for German POWs in Soviet captivity was roughly 66%, and that number included men who were released as invalids broken in body and mind. Every German soldier understood this math. It was not complicated. If you were going to surrender, you surrendered to the Americans or British. If you were captured by the Soviets, you prayed for a quick death, because the alternative was years of slow dying in conditions designed to extract maximum labor before you expired. The terror of Soviet captivity was not irrational fear created by propaganda. It was rational calculation based on documented reality, and it was the reason that 300,000 men in the Ruhr Pocket were willing to walk toward American lines with white flags, risking being shot as deserters by their own side, because the alternative was waiting for the Soviets to arrive. The geography of April 1945 made the choice even more urgent. The Red Army was advancing rapidly from the east, already fighting in the suburbs of Berlin, already overrunning German positions in Saxony and Thuringia. The race was on, not between the Allies to see who would capture Berlin, but between individual German soldiers to see who could reach American lines before the Soviets reached them. In the Ruhr Pocket, that race had a clear winner. The Americans had completed the encirclement. The Soviets were still hundreds of kilometers to the east. If you were going to surrender, this was the time and place to do it. Walk west, find a GI, and live. Wait, and risk the Soviets arriving first. It was not a difficult choice. It was the only choice, and hundreds of thousands of men were making it. Hauptmann Werner Steiner had sworn a personal oath to Adolf Hitler on August 2, 1934, the day the German military oath was changed from loyalty to the Constitution to loyalty to the Führer personally. He had been 23 years old, a young lieutenant who believed in duty, honor, and the restoration of German military pride after the humiliation of Versailles. The oath had seemed reasonable then, even noble. A soldier should be loyal to his commander-in-chief. That was basic military discipline. 11 years later, in a basement in the Ruhr, that oath had become a chain around his neck, dragging him toward a death that would accomplish nothing and save no one. Steiner was a professional officer, not a Nazi party member, not a political soldier. He had joined the Wehrmacht because it was the family tradition, because his father had been an officer in the Kaiser's army, because military service was what men of his class did. He had fought in Poland and France, spent 2 years on the Eastern Front, and been wounded twice. He wore the Iron Cross First Class and the German Cross in gold. He knew his profession, and his profession told him that the war was over, that Germany had lost, that continuing to fight was not courage, but murder. Every day he kept his men in the line was another day they might be killed for a cause that no longer existed. Every order to hold position was an order to die for nothing. But the oath bound him to obey Hitler's orders, and Hitler's orders were clear. No surrender. Fight to the last man. Every soldier who retreats is a traitor. The Führer had made it explicit in multiple directives. Any officer who surrendered would be considered to have broken his oath, dishonored his uniform, and betrayed the German people. His family would be arrested, his name struck from military records, his memory condemned. Steiner had 40 men left from a company that had started the war with 200. They were boys and exhausted veterans, held together by discipline and the fading belief that their officers knew what they were doing. They had no food, no ammunition, and no chance of survival if they continued fighting. The Americans were 2 kilometers away with tanks, artillery, and air support. His men had rifles with 12 rounds each, and no anti-tank weapons. The military decision was obvious. Surrender. Save his men's lives. Accept captivity. The war would be over in weeks regardless of what he did. His 40 men would make no difference to the outcome. Their deaths would be meaningless. But the oath, if he ordered surrender, he would be breaking his word, violating the code that had defined his entire adult life. He would be a traitor, an oath breaker, a man without honor. Everything he had believed about duty and loyalty would be revealed as empty words. On April 9th, Steiner sat in the basement and thought about his father, who had been a captain in the trenches of the Western Front in 1918 and had come home to a Germany that blamed its soldiers for losing a war the politicians had started. His father had taught him that a soldier's honor was everything, that duty was absolute, that an officer's word was his bond. His father had also taught him that an officer's first duty was to his men, to bring them home alive if possible, to not waste their lives on gestures and symbols. An officer who got his men killed for no reason was not honorable. He was a fool. Steiner made his decision sometime in the early hours of April 10th. He would release his men from their oath because he was their commanding officer, and that was within his authority. He would tell them to walk west and surrender to the Americans, because that was the only way they would survive, and he would live with the consequences, whatever they were, because saving 40 lives was worth his honor. He was not alone. Across the Ruhr Pocket, German officers were making the same calculation, coming to the same conclusion. Some did it quietly, simply telling their men that if they encountered Americans, they were permitted to surrender. Others were more direct, ordering white flags raised and leading their men to Allied lines personally. A few went further, actively seeking out American units to negotiate the surrender of their entire formations. General Major Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the Panzer Lehr Division, one of the elite armored formations of the Wehrmacht, negotiated the surrender of his entire division to American forces on April 15th. Bayerlein was a decorated veteran, a professional soldier who had fought in North Africa and Normandy. He concluded that further resistance was pointless, and that his duty was to preserve the lives of his men. He contacted American commanders, arranged terms, and marched his division into captivity with colors flying. A formal military surrender that acknowledged defeat but maintained dignity. Other officers made similar choices. Battalion commanders ordered white flags raised over their positions. Company commanders told their men to remove their weapons and walk toward American lines. Junior officers simply looked the other way when soldiers slipped away during the night, heading west with improvised white flags. Not everyone agreed. SS officers, true believers in the Nazi cause, viewed surrender as treason, punishable by immediate execution. They set up blocking positions behind Wehrmacht lines, not to stop Americans but to stop German soldiers from retreating. They established drumhead courts-martial that sentenced men to death for defeatism, for cowardice, for suggesting that the war might be lost. They hanged soldiers from lampposts with signs around their necks reading, "I was too cowardly to defend the fatherland." The Wehrmacht was fracturing along ideological lines. Professional officers who understood military reality were trying to save their men. Nazi fanatics were trying to enforce a discipline that no longer had any purpose except to produce corpses. And caught between them were hundreds of thousands of ordinary soldiers who just wanted to survive. Steiner's decision to release his men was an act of rebellion disguised as military pragmatism. He was not overthrowing Hitler or denouncing the regime. He was simply acknowledging that the war was over and that his men deserved a chance to live through it. But in the context of April 1945, that acknowledgement was revolutionary. It meant admitting that everything they had fought for was lost, that the sacrifices had been for nothing, that the only rational choice was surrender. When he climbed the stairs after giving his order, Steiner did not know if he would be shot by an SS patrol, arrested by military police, or simply forgotten in the chaos of collapse. He did not particularly care. He had done what his conscience and his professional judgment told him was right. His men would live. That was enough. Klaus Müller and 12 others left the basement at 8 in the morning on April 10th, 1945. They carried no weapons, no equipment except canteens and the clothes on their backs. Each man had fashioned a white flag from whatever cloth they could find, torn undershirts and bed sheets tied to sticks or branches. They looked like refugees, which in a sense they were. Refugees from a war that had consumed their youth and was now consuming itself. The landscape they walked through was apocalyptic. The Ruhr had been one of the most heavily industrialized regions in Europe. A dense concentration of coal mines, steel mills, chemical plants, and manufacturing facilities that had powered the German war machine. Now it was a wasteland of rubble and twisted metal, bombed by the Allies for years and fought over for weeks. Entire city blocks had been reduced to brick dust. Factories stood as burned-out shells. Their roofs collapsed. Their machinery melted into abstract sculptures by fires that had burned for days. The roads were cratered by artillery, impassable to vehicles, barely navigable on foot. Klaus and his group walked through fields and forests, avoiding the main routes where they might encounter SS patrols or American reconnaissance units that might shoot first and ask questions later. The spring weather was cold and wet, rain falling intermittently from low clouds that also hit American fighter bombers that had been strafing anything that moved. They were not alone. As they walked west, they encountered other groups of German soldiers all heading the same direction, all carrying white flags. Some were alone, individuals who had slipped away from their units during the night. Others were in groups of 5 or 10 or 20, entire squads and platoons that had collectively decided to surrender. They nodded to each other as they passed, but did not speak much. There was nothing to say. They were all making the same choice, walking the same path, hoping for the same outcome. Around noon, they came across a Volkssturm unit, 20 men ranging in age from 16 to 65, armed with a mixture of obsolete rifles and Panzerfausts they had no idea how to use. The old men looked exhausted, the boys looked terrified, and all of them looked relieved to see other soldiers heading west. They fell in with Klaus's group without discussion, safety in numbers even when all of them were unarmed and defenseless. The greatest danger was not from the Americans, but from their own side. SS units were still operating in the pocket, enforcing discipline with summary executions. They had set up checkpoints on major roads, stopping soldiers and demanding to see orders, shooting anyone who admitted they were trying to surrender. Klaus's group avoided these checkpoints by staying off the roads, but twice they heard gunfire in the distance, and once they saw bodies hanging from a railroad bridge, soldiers executed for desertion. In the early afternoon, they sheltered in a destroyed farmhouse while American artillery pounded something a few kilometers to the north. An old woman was living in the cellar, the only survivor of a family that had farmed this land for generations. She gave them bread, half a loaf that was probably the last food she had, and told them the Americans had passed through 2 days earlier, heading east. They were polite, she said. They did not steal or burn anything. They just took what they needed and moved on. She seemed surprised by this, as if she had expected monsters and found ordinary young men instead. Klaus thanked her and left the bread, telling her they would find food with the Americans. She cried and tried to give it back, but they were already leaving, walking west through the rain. At 2:30 in the afternoon, they found the Americans. The patrol was from the 2nd Armored Division, 5 men in combat gear moving carefully through the ruins of a village that had been fought over so many times, it no longer had a name, just a designation on military maps. They saw Klaus's group before Klaus saw them, which was probably the only reason nobody was shot. The Americans took cover and called out in German, telling them to stop, raise their hands, and walk forward slowly. Klaus raised his white flag higher and shouted the one word every German soldier knew would keep him alive: Kamerad, comrade, the universal signal of surrender, the word that meant I am no longer your enemy, I am giving up, please do not shoot me. The American sergeant approached with his rifle ready but not aimed. A professional soldier who had done this before and knew the drill. He was young, maybe 22, well-fed and clean in a way that shocked Klaus, who had not seen a properly supplied soldier in months. The sergeant's uniform was intact, his equipment was complete, and he moved with the confidence of someone who knew his side was winning. The search was thorough but not brutal. The Americans patted them down for weapons, checked for SS tattoos, looked at their identification papers. They were efficient and professional, soldiers doing a job, not conquerors humiliating the defeated. When they were satisfied that Klaus and his group were unarmed Wehrmacht soldiers and not SS trying to infiltrate American lines, the sergeant relaxed slightly. He offered Klaus a canteen of water. Klaus drank and tasted metal and chemicals, American water purification, the most delicious thing he had consumed in weeks. The sergeant gave him a cigarette, an American brand Klaus did not recognize, and lit it for him. Klaus inhaled and felt dizzy, nicotine and relief flooding his system in equal measure. Sit, the sergeant said in broken German, pointing to the ground. Wait, truck comes. They sat in the ruins and waited. The Americans kept watch but did not point their weapons at the prisoners. One of them, a private who looked about 18, offered chocolate from his ration pack. Klaus took it and ate slowly, trying not to vomit from the richness after days of starvation. The chocolate was sweet and thick and tasted like civilization, like a world where supply chains functioned and armies fed their soldiers, and war was conducted according to rules. Klaus had expected execution, or at best brutal treatment, starvation, forced marches, the kind of captivity that Nazi propaganda had promised awaited any German soldier who surrendered to the Allies. Instead, he got water, cigarettes, chocolate, and professional military courtesy. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Everything he had been taught, everything the propaganda had told him, was wrong. The Americans were not monsters. They were just soldiers, doing their jobs, following their orders, treating prisoners according to the laws of war. A truck arrived an hour later, a massive American vehicle that could have carried Klaus's entire company. They were loaded into the back with 30 other prisoners who had been collected from other patrols, all of them Wehrmacht, all of them looking dazed and relieved. The truck drove west, away from the fighting, toward the rear areas where the processing camps were located. Klaus sat in the back of the truck and watched the Ruhr disappear behind him, the smoke and ruins fading into the distance. He was alive. He was a prisoner, but he was alive. He had made the walk west and found an American, and survived. The war for him was over. The American military was unprepared for the scale of surrender in the Ruhr Pocket. The planning had anticipated capturing perhaps 50,000 prisoners over the course of several weeks of fighting. Instead, they got more than 300,000 in less than 2 weeks. A tidal wave of defeated humanity that overwhelmed every system designed to process and house them. The logistics were staggering. Each prisoner needed to be searched, documented, medically screened, and transported to a holding facility. They needed food, water, shelter, and guards. They needed to be separated by rank, by unit, and by potential security risk. SS members had to be identified and segregated for war crimes investigation. Officers had to be separated from enlisted men, according to Geneva Convention requirements. The wounded needed medical treatment. The sick needed quarantine to prevent epidemics. The American solution was organized chaos, a massive improvisation that somehow functioned despite violating every principle of military planning. Temporary holding areas were established in fields, stadiums, warehouses, and any open space large enough to contain thousands of men. Barbed wire was strung in vast rectangles. Guard towers were erected, and the prisoners were simply herded inside and told to wait. The processing system was assembly line efficiency applied to human beings. Each prisoner passed through a series of stations where different aspects of their documentation were handled. Name, rank, serial number, unit, hometown, all recorded on forms that would be filed and eventually used to notify families and organize repatriation. Medical personnel checked for wounds, disease, and malnutrition, separating those who needed immediate treatment. Intelligence officers looked for SS tattoos, checked papers against lists of wanted war criminals, and interviewed anyone who seemed suspicious. The numbers were overwhelming. On April 18, 1945, when the last organized German resistance in the Ruhr Pocket ceased, the Americans had processed 317,000 prisoners, the largest mass surrender of German forces in the entire war. 30 German generals were in custody, including corps and division commanders who had led armies across Europe. Entire divisions had ceased to exist as fighting formations, their men now sitting in muddy fields surrounded by barbed wire, waiting to find out what happened next. The American guards were outnumbered in many camps, sometimes by ratios of 100 to 1. Security depended not on physical control, but on the prisoners' understanding that they had nowhere to go and nothing to gain from escape. The war was ending, Germany was collapsing, and the only place worse than an American POW camp was outside the wire, where you might be recaptured by the SS and executed as a deserter or overrun by Soviet forces advancing from the east. Food was the most immediate challenge. The American military supply system was designed to feed American soldiers, not hundreds of thousands of prisoners. Emergency rations were distributed, C rations and K rations that were intended for combat troops but were now being handed out to prisoners who had been starving for weeks. The caloric content was adequate, around 2,000 calories per day, enough to prevent starvation but not enough to restore men who had been malnourished for months. Klaus Müller arrived at a temporary holding facility near Dusseldorf on April 11th, transported in a convoy of trucks that stretched for kilometers. The camp was a former German military training ground, now surrounded by American barbed wire and guard towers. Thousands of prisoners were already there, sitting in the mud, organized into rough groups by unit and rank. The processing took hours. Klaus stood in line, moved forward when told, answered questions when asked. His papers were checked, his name was recorded, his photograph was taken. A medic looked at him for 30 seconds, pronounced him fit despite obvious malnutrition, and waved him through. He was assigned to a section of the camp designated for enlisted men from the 116th Panzer Division, a rectangle of mud containing about 200 men he had never met, but who had served in the same formation. There were no barracks, no tents, no shelter of any kind. The prisoners sat or stood in the open, exposed to the rain and cold. But there was food, a hot meal served from American field kitchens, stew and bread and coffee that was weak, but hot. Klaus ate slowly, forcing himself not to gulp, knowing that his shrunken stomach would rebel if he ate too fast. Around him, other men were doing the same, eating with the focused intensity of people who had forgotten what it felt like to be full. The first night was miserable, sleeping in the mud with no blankets, cold rain falling intermittently. But Klaus was alive, and that was more than he had expected when he woke up in the basement 2 days earlier. He was a prisoner, but he was an American prisoner, which meant he would probably survive to see the end of the war. Over the following days, the camp became more organized. Tents were erected, latrines were dug, a medical facility was established in a commandeered building. The prisoners were organized into work details, unloading supply trucks, filling sandbags, clearing rubble from nearby roads. The work was not hard, 8 hours a day with breaks, nothing like the slave labor that prisoners in German camps had endured. The Americans followed the Geneva Convention more or less, treating the prisoners as defeated soldiers rather than criminals. Klaus was assigned to a detail unloading food supplies from trucks, ironic work for someone who had been starving a week earlier. The American soldiers supervising the work were professional but not friendly, maintaining the distance between captor and captive. But they were not cruel, did not beat prisoners or withhold food or engage in the casual brutality that had characterized German treatment of Soviet prisoners. The psychological impact was profound. Klaus had spent 3 years being told that the Allies were subhuman, that they would torture and murder any German soldier who fell into their hands, that surrender meant death or worse. Now he was living proof that it was all lies. The Americans fed him, housed him, treated his minor injuries, and followed the rules of war. Everything the Nazi propaganda had said was inverted. The monsters were not the Americans. The monsters had been the people giving the orders on his side. In the evenings, the prisoners talked, sharing stories of how they had been captured, what they had seen, what they thought would happen next. The consensus was that the war would be over within weeks, that Hitler was probably already dead, that Germany would be occupied and divided. Nobody knew what would happen to them, how long they would be prisoners, whether they would ever see their families again. But they were alive, and that was enough for now. Not everyone in the Ruhr Pocket made it to American lines. Not everyone chose to surrender, and not everyone who surrendered survived. The SS units that remained loyal to Hitler fought to the end, refusing to accept that the war was lost. They established defensive positions in the ruins of cities and fought with fanatical intensity, inflicting casualties on American forces and dying in place when their positions were overrun. Some SS soldiers fought until they ran out of ammunition, then committed suicide rather than surrender. Others tried to escape the encirclement, slipping through American lines at night, hoping to reach German territory that was still under Nazi control. Most were caught or killed. A few made it out and continued fighting as part of the last-ditch resistance that would flicker and die in the final weeks of the war. The soldiers who were captured on the eastern edge of the Ruhr Pocket, those who did not make it to American lines before Soviet forces arrived, faced a different fate. The Red Army was advancing rapidly through central Germany in April 1945, and some German units found themselves overrun by Soviet forces before they could reach the Americans. These men became Soviet prisoners, and their survival rate was dramatically lower than those captured by the Western Allies. Soviet POW camps were not designed for prisoner welfare. They were designed to extract maximum labor before the prisoners died. German POWs were sent to work camps in Siberia, Kazakhstan, and the Arctic, where they built roads, mined coal, cut timber, and died of starvation, disease, and exhaustion. The rations were inadequate, the medical care was non-existent, and the guards were often former Soviet POWs who had survived German captivity and were eager for revenge. Of the approximately 3 million German soldiers captured by the Soviets during the war, roughly 1 million died in captivity, a death rate of 33%. The survivors were not released until the 1950s, and many returned home as broken men, physically and psychologically destroyed by a decade of forced labor, in conditions that violated every principle of international law. The soldiers in the Ruhr Pocket who made the choice to walk west, who risked being shot as deserters by their own side, who carried white flags through the ruins toward American lines. had made the correct calculation. West meant life. East meant probable death. The statistics bore this out with brutal clarity. The civilian population trapped in the Ruhr Pocket suffered as well. The region was home to millions of people who found themselves caught between collapsing German forces and advancing American armies. The fighting destroyed homes, infrastructure, and food supplies. Allied bombing had already devastated the cities, and the ground combat finished what the air raids had started. Estimates suggest that more than 10,000 civilians died during the battle for the Ruhr, killed by artillery, bombing, starvation, and disease. The moral calculus of the Ruhr Pocket was stark. Every day the German forces continued to resist was another day of death and destruction for no military purpose. The war was lost, Berlin was about to fall, and Hitler's regime was in its final days. Continuing to fight did not change the outcome. It only increased the body count. The officers who ordered their men to surrender, who released them from their oaths and told them to walk west, were making a choice that saved lives. They were also committing what the Nazi regime considered treason, an act punishable by execution. Some of these officers were later arrested by SS units and shot. Others survived and lived with the knowledge that they had violated their oaths, but saved their men. Field Marshal Model made a different choice. He could not bring himself to surrender, could not accept the humiliation of captivity, could not face the prospect of being tried as a war criminal. On April 15th, he dissolved Army Group B, releasing his soldiers from their oath and telling his officers to make their own decisions about surrender. Then he walked into a forest near Duisburg with his adjutant and his service pistol. On April 21, 1945, Walter Model shot himself. His body was found by German civilians and buried in a quiet ceremony that the Americans allowed. He was 54 years old, one of Hitler's most capable generals, a man who had performed miracles on the Eastern Front and who could not survive the final defeat. Model's suicide was symbolic of the Wehrmacht's collapse. The old order, the military tradition that had defined German officer culture for generations, died with him in that forest. The oath to Hitler, the code of honor that forbade surrender, the belief that a German soldier fought to the last, all of it ended in the Ruhr. The men who survived were the ones who chose life over ideology, who walked west with white flags, who accepted that the war was over, and that survival was more important than honor. Klaus Müller spent 6 months in American captivity, first in the temporary camp near Düsseldorf, then in a larger facility in France designated Camp Lucky Strike, one of several camps named after American cigarette brands. The camp held 60,000 prisoners at its peak, mostly men captured in the Ruhr Pocket and during the final weeks of the war. The conditions were basic, but adequate. The prisoners lived in tents, slept on cots, and received 2 meals a day that provided around 2,000 calories, enough to slowly restore men who had been malnourished. Medical care was available for those who needed it, and the seriously ill were transferred to hospitals. The camp had a library, organized sports, and even a theater where prisoners put on performances to pass the time. Klaus was assigned to a work detail that unloaded supply ships at a nearby port. 8 hours a day of manual labor that was hard, but not brutal. The Americans paid the prisoners in camp script that could be used to buy cigarettes, soap, and other small luxuries from the camp canteen. It was not freedom, but it was not the hell that Nazi propaganda had promised. The psychological adjustment was harder than the physical conditions. Klaus had to confront the fact that everything he had believed for the past 3 years was a lie. The Allies were not monsters. The war had not been a noble struggle for survival. Germany had not been the victim. The atrocities he had heard whispered about, the camps, the mass murders, the systematic extermination of entire populations, were real. The Americans showed the prisoners films of the concentration camps that had been liberated, footage of Bergen-Belsen and Dachau and Buchenwald, and Klaus sat in a tent with 1,000 other men and watched in silence as the evidence of what had been done in their name flickered on the screen. Some men refused to believe it, insisted it was propaganda, claimed the films were faked. Others broke down, wept, or sat in stunned silence. Klaus felt something inside him crack. Not his sanity, but his sense of identity. He had been a German soldier, had believed he was fighting for his country, had trusted his leaders. Now he understood that he had been a tool of evil, that his service had enabled crimes beyond comprehension. that his survival was not a triumph, but a burden he would carry for the rest of his life. In September 1945, Klaus was released from Camp Lucky Strike and transported to Germany for repatriation. The war had been over for 4 months. Hitler was dead, the Nazi regime was destroyed, and Germany was occupied by the 4 Allied powers. Klaus returned to Cologne, the city where he had been born, and found it 80% destroyed, a wasteland of rubble where a city had been. His family had survived, his mother and younger sister living in the basement of their destroyed home, scraping by on rations provided by the British occupation forces. His father had been killed on the Eastern Front in 1943. His older brother had disappeared during the retreat from France and was presumed dead. Klaus was the only man in his family to survive the war. He found work in the reconstruction effort, clearing rubble, rebuilding infrastructure, part of the massive project of putting Germany back together. The work was hard and the pay was minimal, but it was honest labor, building instead of destroying, creating instead of killing. In 1947, Klaus enrolled in a teacher training program funded by the British occupation authorities. He became a school teacher, spending the next 30 years educating German children about the dangers of totalitarianism, the importance of democracy, and the necessity of remembering history so it would not be repeated. He never spoke much about his own experiences, but his students knew he had been there, had seen what happened when a nation followed a madman, and his lessons carried the weight of lived experience. Klaus Müller died in 2003 at the age of 77, a respected teacher and a quiet man who had survived the worst war in human history, and spent the rest of his life trying to make sure it never happened again. His testimony was recorded by the German military archives in 2001, part of a project to preserve the memories of the last generation that had experienced the war firsthand. The Ruhr Pocket was the largest surrender of German forces on the Western Front, a military disaster that removed more than 300,000 soldiers from the war and opened the path for the Allied advance into central Germany. But its significance went beyond military statistics. The Ruhr Pocket demonstrated the total collapse of Wehrmacht cohesion and the failure of Nazi ideology to sustain resistance in the face of inevitable defeat. When officers began telling their men to drop their rifles and walk west, they were admitting that the war was lost, that Hitler's promises were lies, and that survival was more important than loyalty to a regime that had led Germany to catastrophe. The mass surrender also illustrated the rational calculation that German soldiers made about their chances of survival. The terror of Soviet captivity was real, based on documented brutality and statistical reality. The preference for American captivity was not cowardice but pragmatism, a choice to live rather than die for a lost cause. For the Americans, the Ruhr Pocket was a logistical challenge that tested their ability to process and care for hundreds of thousands of prisoners while continuing offensive operations. They succeeded, more or less, following the Geneva Convention and treating the prisoners as defeated soldiers rather than criminals. The contrast with Soviet treatment of German POWs was stark and would shape German attitudes toward the Western Allies for generations. The human element of the Ruhr Pocket is what makes it historically significant beyond the military facts. 300,000 men chose life over ideology, walked away from a war that was already lost, and accepted captivity as the price of survival. Their choice was individual but collective, a mass rejection of the Nazi regime's demand for suicidal resistance. The officers who released their men from their oaths, who told them to walk west and find an American, were committing an act of rebellion disguised as military pragmatism. They were acknowledging that the oath to Hitler was worthless, that the Führer's orders were insane, and that their duty was to their men, not to a regime that was collapsing into the bunker in Berlin. Field Marshal model suicide was the counterpoint, the old order dying rather than accepting defeat. His choice was tragic, but also symbolic of the bankruptcy of the military tradition that had enabled Hitler's rise and Germany's catastrophe. The code of honor that forbade surrender had become a suicide pact, and Model followed it to its logical conclusion. The survivors, men like Klaus Müller, carried the memory of the Ruhr Pocket for the rest of their lives. They had made the walk west, had raised white flags, had chosen survival over honor as defined by the Nazi regime. They had been proven right by history. The war ended weeks after the Ruhr Pocket fell. Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. Germany was occupied and divided. The men who surrendered in the Ruhr went home to their families. The men who fought to the end died in the ruins. In a 2001 interview 2 years before his death, Klaus Müller reflected on the walk west that had saved his life. That walk west, April 10, 1945, was the longest of my life. Every step was away from Hitler's war, toward American lines, toward survival. I was terrified the entire time. Terrified the SS would catch us and hang us as deserters. Terrified the Americans would shoot us before we could surrender. Terrified that I was making the wrong choice, that I was a coward, that I was betraying everything I had been taught to believe. When that American sergeant gave me water and a cigarette, when he treated me like a human being instead of an enemy to be destroyed, I knew. We had been lied to about everything. The Americans were not monsters. We were the ones who had fought for monsters. That walk west saved my life. But more than that, it taught me what civilization actually means. It means treating your enemies with dignity. It means following rules even when you do not have to. It means choosing life over death, reason over fanaticism, humanity over ideology. I spent the rest of my life trying to teach that lesson to young people. I do not know if I succeeded, but I had to try. Because I was there. I saw what happens when a nation follows a madman. I saw the ruins, the death, the waste of it all. And I saw the alternative, the American sergeant who gave me water when he could have shot me. That is the choice we all face, every day. Civilization or barbarism. Life or death, I chose life. I walked west, and I survived to tell the story. The Ruhr Pocket was not the largest battle of World War II, not the bloodiest, not the most strategically significant, but it was the moment when 300,000 men chose to walk away from Hitler's war, to drop their rifles and walk west, to find an American and live. That choice, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of individual decisions, was the real end of the Third Reich. Not in the bunker in Berlin, but in the ruins of the Ruhr, where ordinary soldiers decided that survival was more important than ideology, and that life was worth more than a madman's dream of glory. Stories like Klaus Müller's deserve to be remembered. If you want more deep dives into the human side of history, subscribe to the channel. Leave a like if this moved you and comment below. What other forgotten moments from World War II should we explore together?